The conclusion of the book of Judges is, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In other words, the time of Judges is a period of low morality in Israel. It shows the dreadful consequences of ignoring God's word. And yet we see his continued grace despite his people's sin. There's lots of examples of the low morality during the time period of Judges. There's idolatry. They're worshiping Canaanite gods and goddesses. There's Samson, who violates his Nazirite vow, who marries a pagan, who runs around with loose women. There's Jephthah, who, contrary to the Bible, offers his daughter up as a human sacrifice. There's the idolatrous and immoral priesthood as seen in Micah and his Levite. There's Sodom-like behavior among the Benjaminites in that incident involving the Ephraimite Levite's concubine. There's a civil war against Ephraim in Jephthah's day, and a civil war against Benjamin. And so the theology is, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Theological themes. We see God's grace, but we see that in tension with his justice. Elements of God's grace in this book. He sends judges despite Israel's sins. The covenant continues despite the frequent covenant violations of the people. God continues to be faithful despite the unfaithfulness of his people. We also see elements of God's justice. Israel was not given rest from their enemies because of the lack of faithfulness. They were not given full possession of the land. The flawed character of their deliverers reflects the fact that they were unfit to give them true deliverance. So in this book, God neither abandons his people when they sin, nor does he wink at and ignore sin. He shows himself both to be holy and compassionate in dealing with his sinful people. We also see something of the kingship of Yahweh in this book. This is expressed by Gideon in Judges chapter 8, verses 23 and 24. When he was offered the kingship, Gideon responded, "I will not rule over you. My son will not rule over you. Yahweh will rule over you." Express the concept of the kingship of Yahweh. And this is expressed in the whole idea of charismatic leadership. God was the real king, and God as king could appoint judges, raise them up, but he was the real judge who was behind the individual judges. Now, of course, not every Israelite bought into this theology. Those who asked Gideon to become king didn't believe it, nor did Gideon's own son Abimelech. But the motto, "There was no king in Israel," implies that for many of them, not even God was really king for them. There were heroes with mighty deeds. Hebrews chapter 11 speaks of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah as among the heroes of faith, who by faith did mighty deeds for God. So there are examples of faith. We have a female hero, actually two of them. You have Deborah, called as a judge as well as a prophetess. And you have the woman Jael, who was involved in the victory as well. And this is an encouragement that God can, at least in certain circumstances, call a woman to leadership and ministry positions among his people. Another theme: God can use flawed and unexpected heroes. We have a reluctant farmer of no pedigree who badgered God by demanding 2 miracles before he would go, and who ultimately fell into false worship. And of course, that is the judge, Gideon. You have a left-handed assassin who wins by deceit and treachery. And that, of course, is Ehud. You have a mere woman, Deborah. You have a bastard child of a prostitute whose foolish vow destroyed his daughter, Jephthah. You have a sex-addicted Nazarite, Samson. Well, if God can use characters as flawed as these, well, maybe he can use characters as flawed as you and me. So there's a bit of encouragement by this use of flawed heroes. Another theme that we see here has to do with assimilation to paganism versus holiness. Basically, the Israelites were adopting Canaanite culture and values, which was leading Israel little by little to cease to be the people that God had intended for them to be. Now, this was subtle in the case of Micah and his priests. I mean, they were worshiping Yahweh after all, though in an idolatrous way using images. But then sometimes it was more overt, where they went all the way to worshiping Baal and Ashtoreth and the various other Canaanite deities. They failed to maintain the holiness that God expects of his people. And of course, the same thing can happen to any of us. We must diligently maintain both doctrinal and moral purity. There's also a hint of Messianic promise here. The account is strongly pro-David and anti-Saul in many points, particularly in the story of the Ephraimite Levite's concubine. Who will treat Ephraimites well? Well, someone from Judah or Bethlehem, as the father of the concubine did, related to David, of course. Who will make Jebus or Jerusalem safe? Well, David from Bethlehem, not Saul from Gibeah, which was a very unsafe place. And so there's a messianic promise here concerning the line of David, a kind of a promotion of the line of David. David, of course, is an ancestor of Jesus Christ and foreshadows him. Well, that concludes our discussion of the book of Judges.